Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at Ironhack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast, and we are with Ray today. But Ray, before we kick off, are you prepared to engage?
Rob, absolutely. So looking forward to this.
So Raymond A. Kimball is an educational professional with years of experience in game-based learning and collaborative professional development that meets the needs of diverse teams. He founded 42 Education Games, Coaching and Design in 2020 so he could continue his dream of serving higher education faculty by helping them harness the power of games-based pedagogy. And in that role, Ray works with higher education faculty to adapt existing games or design new ones to meet the needs of diverse classrooms. He spent a 20-plus year veteran for the United States Army and taught history for 10 years at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and integrated some game-based learning from the very beginning. He's used those in every single course he taught to help students better grasp difficult concepts and develop a sense of historical empathy. He's also advocated for game-based learning and introduced the Reacting to the Past methodology there, where it is now used in the core freshman Western history course. And while on faculty, he brought in multiple gaming experts to showcase varied ways that games-based pedagogy can change the students' lives. So Ray, is there anything that we're missing, anything we're leaving outside of that intro?
No, Rob, that's a great intro. And what I really hope that folks take away from that intro is that I'm somebody who is incredibly passionate about game-based learning and really, really passionate about helping faculty who might be on the fence about game-based learning or who aren't really sure if it's for them, helping those faculty really harness that power of learning in a way that works for their unique educational context.
That sounds great. That sounds fantastic. So Ray, what would being Ray for a day look like? What would it feel like? We want to sort of, get to know you a little bit more.
Sure, absolutely. So great days for me are when I get to do the primary job of my company, which is working with higher ed faculty. And so, a day like that, what that starts with is me sitting down and listening to a faculty member and really getting a sense of what their context is, both classroom context and institutional. Everybody thinks about classroom context and says, oh, yes, of course, a history course is going to be different from a literature course, is going to be different from an engineering course. And so, of course, we discuss that and we talk about what their classroom composition looks like and what their approaches are and what their teaching philosophy is. And that's really important. But equally important, and that often gets overlooked, is the institutional context, right? People's classrooms don't exist in a vacuum. They are part of a larger department and they are part of a larger institution. And those department and institutional cultures have influence on what gets taught and what gets presented there. So it's vital for me that I understand that institutional context so that I'm not proposing things that are a complete non-starter for that faculty member. For instance, some institutions may be wild about the idea of role-playing games, but a digital game is a non-starter for that institution because of infrastructure problems. Or some institutions may be really crazy about tabletop games and they love the idea, the visual of having folks around that, but the idea of people acting out roles in role-playing games is maybe just a little too far out there for that institution. So it really all starts with understanding that context. And then I go out and I find an existing game that works for them and build the scaffolds that they need for it, right? We don't want to just drop a game in somebody's lap and say, okay, here you go, have fun, hope this works for you. I mean, that's not serving the individual faculty member well. So I'm going to create the scaffolds that they need. Maybe it's a one-page guide for students. Maybe it's an addendum for their syllabus, but I'm going to come up with those materials that are necessary to really streamline and bring that game into the classroom smoothly. And then finally, after delivering the game to them, checking in to make sure that that game is functioning. And what I'm really proud of is that I can do all of that at a cost point that basically costs a faculty member more or less what they would pay to attend an annual conference. I recognize that dollars are short in higher education. And so I want to make sure that folks are getting the maximum value out of it. And I really do feel like I deliver a good value for money in that respect.
That is great. Money is also important, especially when it's, the investment that comes from the institution, or even sometimes it might come from even the same educator's pocket, right?
Absolutely. Both routes are definitely viable.
There you go. So that's very important to keep in mind. What's the value that you're getting for that? However, we would like to go now for a story. We would like to go for something a little bit different. It's not just about the great times that you've done amazing things, which I'm sure you have plenty of stories, and we will get into at least one of those in a minute. But before that, we would like to know of one of those times that was not incredible. One of those times that you could call your favorite fail or first attempt in learning, favorite failure, wherever you want to take that route down with us, because we want to be there with you. We want to take some lessons. We want to know how you got out of that fail that took you probably to where you are today.
Rob, I'm really glad you asked that because I love this idea of the favorite failure. A quick sidebar, the old Games Learning and Society conference that was hosted at University of Wisconsin-Madison used to have a regular panel that they called the Hall of Failure, where they had people doing exactly what you're doing now, which is sharing their big failure stories. And to me, that was one of the best parts of the conference. And now that GLS is coming back at University of California, Irvine, I'm really hoping that they revise that. But my favorite failure was the evolution of my Cuban Missile Crisis game. It's called Eyeball to Eyeball, and it's a classroom simulation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I built it while I was an instructor at West Point, and it was a pretty straightforward US versus USSR kind of head-to-head classroom role-playing game. And I fleshed it out, and I shared it through the Reacting to the Past community. And about 3 months after I shared it there, I got feedback from a faculty member who had used it who said, hey, this was fun, but it's really narrow. You're ignoring all of the Cuban agency as part of this. You're ignoring the role that other parts of the world community played in the Cuban Missile Crisis. You've really taken a very myopic and narrow focus on this. And that really hit me. I was very proud of this game. And then as I sat back and as I read the feedback, I said, wow, she's absolutely right. This is a narrow game. The great thing was Dr. Kimberly Redding of Carroll University, she actually, in addition to pointing out the narrowness, said, hey, here's a couple Cuban roles I wrote for the game. Hope that you like them. Consider integrating them. And I said, look, not only do I want to integrate these, but I'd like to bring you on as a co-author to revise this game. And that's exactly what I did. We've never met face-to-face, but we've been working together now for over 2 years on various iterations and revisions of the game. We're now at the point where we're actually in the midst of a revise and resubmit from an academic publisher, and we're hoping that in the new year we'll get it resubmitted and have that game out and becoming commercially available. But that game would have never reached that point if I hadn't shared it with that broader community and had Kimberly Redding reach out and go, hey, you missed the mark here. You fell short.
Very interesting. So that is a great story, Ray. We really enjoyed that one because it involves both the side of, what went wrong in a way, but it also shows us how iteration is also an integral part of what you're doing and how we can actually aim for the best that we can get, not through getting it right necessarily the first time, but actually through also going and trying again, seeing what's wrong, iterating and perfecting your product in that sense. So thank you for that story, Ray. And as I sort of anticipated before, now we would like to go for actually a time where, it actually went well. Something that you would like to say, maybe it's a proud moment, something, one of those stories of success where you had this big, hairy problem and you solved it using games in whatever way you want to show this one.
Absolutely. It was the problem that I faced really when I first started teaching, which was that, I was teaching our core freshman history course, and these were students that some of them were very interested in history, but a lot of them, frankly, weren't. This was something that they were doing because they had to do. They were tired. They were stressed out. These were all first-year students, and the first year, especially at the academy, can be very stressful. There's a lot weighing on cadets. They are trying to get used to military life. They're trying to get used to Army life. So in a lot of cases, they're incentivized to do the bare minimum, especially in the core courses, in the mandatory courses, and then move on from that. So the problem that I was really facing was how do I make my class engaging? How do I make them want to come to class and engage with this material? Not just doing the reading. Of course, we complain about doing the reading, but it's more than just doing the reading. It's about engaging with the material, and it's about engaging with each other. And as I was wrestling on how to do this, I thought back to my days in role playing. I was a Dungeons and Dragons role player, and I said, well, maybe I'll try little bits of this and try and see how this works. And so my very first one was just a very simple role play with Greek philosophy. And what I told them basically was, hey, you are playing Greek philosophers who are trying to convince me how to raise my son. My son was 5 years old at the time and was just getting ready to start school. And so I basically had them pitch me on why their particular philosophy was going to be the best way for me to raise my son. And it was a runaway hit. They had an absolute blast. They totally got into it. They were engaging with each other. They were undercutting each other's points in a professional way, but in a way that was also grounded in the source documents. And I said, wow. This is the way forward. This is the way. There's something to this. Absolutely. And so from that point forward, I made sure that I had at least one lesson in each of our 3 blocks that was devoted to a particular game. And what I found was that students really looked forward to that, right? They heard about the games that I was playing and they really got into it and they really looked forward to it. I even had students look forward to the final exam one year because it was a role-playing game, right? How many times has that ever happened? Because it was a role-playing game-based final exam. It was a simulation of post-Soviet political dynamics where they were playing kind of different power brokers, and they were evaluated not only on their performance in the role-playing game, but also in how they took what had been presented in the game and was able to apply it in the larger context of the course in a follow-on essay. And that's the only time that I've ever gotten student course feedback that said, I really enjoyed the final exam in this course. And I said, wow, this is definitely a keeper. This is the way I want to go. It's
a keeper for sure. And whenever, as you were saying at the start, whenever the context allows for doing something like that, engagers, I would definitely encourage you to run away as far as you can from the normal, natural, standard exam, final exam. Whenever you can, run away from that. It's standard. It is boring. It is not something students look forward to. And quite frankly, if I may, I don't think it's even the best way for us to be able to gauge their level of current understanding on the subject, let alone how much they've learned since they start. That is even harder to do in any case, but even gauging their current level of knowledge is really, really hard with an exam, no matter now. I was going to say no matter how well you do it, but there's better and worse ways to do it. But in general, the typical exam is not going to be a very good place to do that. I don't know, Ray, if you agree with me.
Oh, Rob, I 100% agree with you. I got so dissatisfied with kind of conventional exams. You can play with it a little bit with kind of different wording of questions and sometimes by integrating media into it. But really at its core, I got very dissatisfied with the model of come into a room and write for your life for 3.5 hours. And so I really looked for ways to tackle that differently. And this role-playing game was by far the one that I was happiest with and that I actually used twice more when I had the opportunity.
Nice. That sounds like a very nice experience for sure. And maybe an example for some of the engagers out there. If you cannot do it for the final exam, maybe the midterm.
Yeah,
maybe
absolutely.
Do it for something. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Do it for something, somewhere. I mean, your students will thank you for that. Maybe the first time won't be perfect. Definitely won't be perfect. You will be able to improve upon that, but then you will have a lesson learned. You will be getting better. And definitely your students are going to benefit from that. They're going to be happier. And if, like me, one of the metrics that you get graded on as a professor is student satisfaction, well, you will be thanking us for that as well, for sure.
Yeah, Rob, no question. And in fact, to chime in on your point, yes, your first time is not going to be perfect. But one of the really neat things that I found was that my students' tolerance for imperfection grew significantly when I introduced game-based learning because they appreciated the fact that I was trying something different, right? That I wasn't just staying in my safe zone, that I wasn't just doing lecture, that I wasn't just having them go up and present on chalkboards and stuff like that, that I was actually trying something different. And as a result, they were definitely more willing to give me that grace of, oh, oh, okay, yeah, this wasn't perfect, but it was still better than sitting and listening to a lecture all day.
Yes, yes, and yes. So, Ray, you've done many things. You've spent quite some time doing this games-based learning. Is there, some sort of, when you're creating a lesson or when you're creating maybe even a game for a class, I don't know, can you talk of any sort of process, series of steps? Now that you're teaching it as well, I'm sure that it's maybe a little bit more organized. I don't know. How do you do it? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah. So to me, it starts with listening, right? It starts with sitting down, listening to the students, listening to the faculty, listening to institutions, and really hearing what it is that they want. Right? In a class, that listening may be happening based on course evals, but it can also just be as simple as listening to the conversations that are happening before and after class and what people are talking about and what people aren't talking about. In terms of listening to faculty, hearing what colleagues are saying, but also being part of faculty associations outside of your institution and hearing different ideas and different things that are being tried out there. And then, of course, in the institutional context, just being aware of what's going on in the institution, understanding how different the cultural context can be in different departments and being attuned to that. So it starts with that listening, because that listening is going to get you oriented in the right direction. To use an orienteering metaphor, it's going to give you that initial azimuth that you need to set out on that you can then adjust as you need be. So then comes the hard work of research, right? Then comes the hard work of actually digging in and finding sources that are scholarly valid. But part of it also is looking for work that's already been done in this area, and to the greatest extent possible, building on that work, right? I am not so arrogant as to think that I can come up with a perfect solution the first time up, nor should I have to. I should be able to look for other people's work in this area, credit them appropriately, whether that's an acknowledgement, whether that's payment for services, whatever the appropriate medium is and whatever the appropriate acknowledgement is, certainly you do that. And then look for ways to integrate that into your solution so that what you're doing, as you said before, what you're doing is iterative. It doesn't necessarily need to be groundbreaking. I mean, it may be groundbreaking in your particular location, but in the larger context, it doesn't need to be groundbreaking. You can be taking the hard work of individuals who came before you and really innovating in a way that makes things possible for you and for the folks that you're working for. And I think people who have their work incorporated in that way, in a way that acknowledges them and that acknowledges their work, are really genuinely grateful and appreciative of that. And then the last piece, once you're starting to get that product together and once you think that you've got something that's viable, now it's time to listen again. And this can be probably the hardest part of the process, right? Because you are super proud of what you have built. You put a lot of time and a lot of effort, and you're like, man, I did an awesome job on this. Well, now you've got to be willing to put it in front of somebody and risk them telling you, I didn't care for it. And boy, that can be just soul crushing when it happens. But you have to recognize that that's part of making your game better, right? You're not writing your game for you. You're writing it for them. So if they don't like it, if you've missed the mark, if you haven't inspired them, well, okay, it's time for you to do some more work. It's time for you to do some more tweaking. So that framework of listen, research, listen has really served me well in a lot of different organizational contexts, to be honest, not just game-based learning. I recommend it to anybody who's a leader, right? Listening, researching, and listening when you're a leader of an organization is a great way to really harness the power in that organization. But it especially works well for me when we're talking about game-based development.
That sounds like a very good way to approach it, Ray, for sure.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
And Ray, again, in your experience, you've done many of these things. You've spent many years thinking about this, doing the things that we're talking about, that we're discussing here. Is there any sort of best practice, anything that you would say, well, if you're going to introduce games-based learning into your classroom, into your corporate learning, whatever that is, this is probably going to make it at least a lot better?
Yeah, so the one thing when I think specifically about like game design, one of the things that I'm really trying to wrap my arms around now and just appreciate the power of is the universal design for learning framework. Making games as accessible as possible to the broad diversity of our learners, recognizing that broad diversity and designing our games in a way that makes them accessible for all. Okay, so looking for those multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple ways of action and expression. We really do have to recognize both the individual talents and also the individual challenges that our students bring into the classroom. And so I've really only started to play with it in the last year or two after a colleague introduced it to me. But the Universal Design for Learning, which a lot of times gets shorthanded as UDL, has really challenged me to step back and think about how I design games and how I make them as accessible as possible. And I'm really enjoying it as a challenge and as a way to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in games.
Sounds great. And I would challenge you, if you have, any quick practical example of what that would look like in one of the things that you've done, that would be great to sort of ground the audience and understand better what it is you're referring to if they haven't discussed or seen that UDL principle before.
Sure, absolutely. So the UDL principles themselves are very broad and probably, frankly, kind of beyond the scope of our conversation. But just to give you a specific example of how I've been trying to tweak things. So when I'm color coding things, one of the things that I'm looking at is making sure that if something needs to be color coded, that there's also a particular design or a particular pattern incorporated with that color so that people who are colorblind don't miss out on that aspect of the game. It's a fairly simple idea, and yet it can be really, really challenging to incorporate in practice. But just putting that little extra piece of effort, that little additional piece of inclusivity, really, I think, speaks volumes to your broader philosophy of your game and your willingness to incorporate folks from all walks of life, from all identities, from different abilities, and your desire to have them as players in your game.
I have an interesting example from somebody who's actually a visual designer who I know pretty close to me, and he's colorblind, like black and white kind of colorblind. And he designs, visual stuff. Of course, he's had to learn sort of by heart what are the principles, what color goes where. So, I mean, it's a real interesting challenge for this person, but they're definitely very tuned into what that looks like, what that means for somebody like themselves. So that's an interesting example as well. Thank you for that, Ray.
No problem.
And talking about these recommendations, is there somebody, listening to the questions that we've had, you also came in thanks to a recommendation of Dave Eng, that is a common friend that we have. Is there somebody that you think of and you say, oh, I'd really like to listen to this person answering these questions or similar questions in Professor Game?
Yeah, absolutely. The person that comes to mind immediately is Professor Mark Carnes at Columbia University. He is the executive director of the Reacting Consortium and the guy who really founded and came up with the Reacting to the Past pedagogy. I referenced this before briefly, but just to dive in for folks who may not be familiar with it, Reacting to the Past is a series of historical-based role-playing games primarily oriented at higher ed that's situated in actual historical situations that uses actual historical characters. So for the most part, either real individuals or in some cases, real archetypes that were present at the time, and then challenges students to play out those situations, specifically referring to primary source documents and other rich texts of the time. So it's a really amazing pedagogy, specifically not only for teaching history, but there's also applications for literature. There's even some STEM applications as well. And Mark Carnes is really the guy who kicked all of it off. And he now heads this group called the Reacting Consortium, which is an alliance of college and universities across the country and around the world that advocate for this pedagogy and who implement it. And I would love to hear him talk about how he has seen Reacting start and grow and evolve over the 2+ decades that he's been championing it.
Nice. Sounds like a very interesting person to have as well. And continuing with that rant of recommendations, is there a book that you recommend this audience, the engagers, again, thinking of games-based learning, maybe games-based solutions, I don't know, whatever you want to go for, even if it's, general inspiration and not necessarily super directly focused. What would you go for? What would you recommend?
So continuing with my theme of reacting to the past, there's a recent book that just came out called Playing to Learn with Reacting to the Past. And what it is it's a compilation of empirical articles that lay out in hard numbers how reacting games impact people's classes, how role-playing games bring out different aspects of people's classes. You know, one of the big critiques that's often leveled at game-based learning is, oh, you're just out there having fun. You can't actually show that you're having any real impact. And so this was a challenge that the reacting community took up and said, okay, we're going to show you this. And so they did it. They did the hard work of empirical research, of control groups, of measurements, and they did it with multiple different games in multiple different schools and compiled it all as a community effort into a published volume. So to me, there's a couple things that I love about this book. One, obviously, it's just great ammunition for that argument when people say, oh, you're just messing around. You don't have any proof. But I also love that it really shows what a community who's passionate about a pedagogy, what a community can do in terms of coming together and doing something on behalf of that entire community and the larger community of teachers. And so to me, the example that it sets, as well as the content, is really, really inspiring. And that's why I wanted to mention it here today.
Sounds like a great one to have in our libraries to take a look at, to check out. And as you were saying, to bring up to those discussions where, you guys are just fooling around. Sounds like a very good and validated way, at least for the model used by reacting to the past, for sure. And talking about recommendations, and actually shifting towards you. Is there something that you would say is or actually, what is it that you would say is your superpower in games-based learning? That thing that you do at least better than most other people?
My superpower, so this is going to sound odd to say, but my superpower is humility. Okay. And I recognize that sounds odd, right? Ooh, my superpower is humility. That would seem to be a contradiction in terms, but let me explain a little bit why I say that. Humility really drives everything that I do. I talked about that listen, research, listen model. That model isn't possible without a healthy dose of humility and without willingness to really put yourself out there and to really be attuned to the needs and to the desires of others. But when you practice it and when you really live out not just fake humility, but real humility on a day-to-day basis, it opens you up to new ideas and new approaches. President Reagan very famously had a saying on his desk in the Oval Office, there's no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. And that has always really resonated with me that, hey, what we're trying to do in higher ed, we're trying to see our students succeed. We're trying to see how they can get ahead and how they can become not only better scholars, but better people. And so being willing and open to the idea of letting other folks come in and letting other folks help and using other folks' ideas, again, appropriately crediting them, right? Appropriately making sure that people are compensated and acknowledged for their work. But being open to all those new ideas and being humble enough to think of, okay, I don't have to be the top dog on this. I don't have to come up with every solution. I can find a way using somebody else's work to meet this need. So that's why I say, for me, humility is my superpower.
There you go. It definitely is. I think it is something always important to keep at. Not everybody has all the humility, has a big thing in their lives. But, always, every single time, I agree that at least a dose of humility is very, very important. And I would add that definitely, as you were saying, the iterative methodology basically is, founded on the fact that you have to be humble enough to say, well, I might be wrong. And the chances are that I am wrong. Let's find out where and what am I wrong about so that I can correct it and actually get better. Very good principle.
Absolutely.
Well, and we arrived to a very difficult question, I have to say. This is the one that, would equivalent? No, that's not the word. To make it equal to, maybe, to that final exam that we submit our students to every now and then. And it is the question of, what would you say is your favorite game?
Oh, this is so difficult. For all the talk that I've done about role-playing games, I suspect your listeners are probably expecting me to say Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, I love me some old school D&D. My son is big into 5th edition now, and I love that platform continues. But when I really thought about this and reflected on it, I really have to say that my absolute favorite game, and I'm going to date myself here a little bit, is the original Deus Ex. It was a digital first-person shooter, came out late 90s, early 2000s, I think. And the thing that I love about Deus Ex is that it starts out as a very, as just a very simple, straightforward first-person shooter in the model of Call of Duty, which was just getting its legs underneath it at that point. It hadn't kind of become the giant juggernaut that it is now. And it starts out, hey, you're this anti-terrorist cop, and you're going out and you're taking down the bad guys. And what you discover very quickly is you start to discover these human nuances of the people you're fighting. And you're starting to find out different twists and different turns that the story takes, not in a predictable way. And so if there's folks out there who haven't played Deus Ex, I absolutely will not spoil the game for you. I will just say that it's an amazing game. It is a great game for thinking not only about ethical choices, but also about different modes of gameplay, because you can really play this game and, you can play it as kind of the classic Avenging Angel, level everything in sight, or you can play it as completely non-lethal, and you can play the entire game and never kill a single individual. And then, obviously there's mixes in between. But the whole series of sequels that had spawned off on that, there were a couple reboots that happened in the last couple of years, which were equally good. The whole series is like that and has it as that hallmark, that ethical grayness and that need to make moral choices that ultimately drive the world around you. And so when I really think about a game that I played that impacted my view of what games could be and games could do, I really take it back to playing Deus Ex as a junior officer, as a 20, 30-something back in the day.
There you go. A game as well, which has something that is very, very important to games, which is consequences of your actions. And here it's not just whether you get, caught or killed or whatever that may look like in a first-person shooter. It also has other things that are involved. And again, no spoiling in the game. I've heard many interesting things. And I have to say, I haven't bought it yet. I haven't bought one version, but I am very much looking forward to playing one of those.
It's excellent. If you want to play the original, I think the original is actually available on Good Old Games, so you can buy it fairly cheaply and it'll work on a modern platform, and it is absolutely, absolutely worth the time.
Sounds fantastic. So, Ray, thank you very much for being with us today, for investing this time with the engagers. Do you have any final piece of advice, any final words? Please let us know where we can find more about you, about 42 Education Games, coaching and design. Like this is the time for you to basically take it wherever you want to steer us.
Rob, thanks. I really appreciate that. The main thing I'll just say is if there's higher ed faculty out there who are on the fence, maybe you're not really sure about this whole game-based learning thing, you're not sure about the commitment of time, that's what I'm here for. That's what my company is here for, is to make it easy for you to try it out and see if it works for you. And that's what we're committed to doing, is making sure that we're respecting your needs and your prerogatives right from day one, and then helping you to get a game-based solution that works for your specific classroom. So you can find us at 42ed.games, so 42ed.games. We're also on social media as 42ed Games. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and looking forward to hear from folks. And please let us know how we can help bring games into your classroom.
Let's do it. Let's bring games into the classroom for sure. And we have Ray to support us. So thanks again, Ray, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, all of the things that you've shared on the podcast. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more interviews with incredible guests like Raymond, all you have to do is go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started into our email list for free. That way we'll be in contact and you'll be the first to know of any opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. And before you go on to your next mission, remember to subscribe for free or follow using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.